Thank you for joining me for this episode of God Talk. And in this episode of God Talk, we are now less than 2 weeks away from the election. And I don't know if you've noticed, but there's been something eerily, weirdly missing from the conversation this election cycle. And if you're going to guess what it is, I don't know that you would be able to, but I just was thinking about this yesterday. But you know what we have not heard mentioned? I honestly can't remember the last time. There's been no outbreak of chatter about racism, white privilege, and in all of these different categories that oftentimes get brought up just before elections. Think about the last time the media kind of hooked on to dialogue and blew up over the topic of racism. I'm trying to think if I know it happened just before the elections 4 years ago, but I'm trying to remember if it's happened since then, and I don't recall that it has. Because in the end, this is what happens almost every election cycle, is that in order to turn out the base, like the media is they're a mouthpiece for the left, and it is in their best interest to get as many Democrats to vote as possible. And by and large, a majority of blacks and even Hispanics vote Democrat. And so they will, especially with black racism against blacks, that they will latch on to some news event. Now, this might have happened in some outside, like 30 miles outside of some town of 800 in rural Georgia. Like it might be the most random, like, news story that there could be, but they'll pick up on it, they'll latch on to it. All of a sudden, all the other outlets will pick up on it, and it will turn into this big explosion of racism, and then sometimes it leads to big protests in these large cities, cop cars being turned over, fires being started. Like, none of that. I mean, if I could have made a wager, if someone would have said, do you think racism is going to be a major topic in the coming presidential election? Someone would have been willing to bet me on that a year or 2 years ago. I I I think I would have just looked at my bank account, seen how much I had, and that's how much I would have bet that topic would be brought up, because it's in the best interest of the left to fan those flames and to stoke those fires of racism, to get a section of their contingency, their supporters, to get them motivated, to get them riled up, to get them to want to get out there and vote. And what's interesting is that, I mean, that has not gone on in this election cycle. I read the news almost daily. A lot of times I read the news through Apple, which pulls up a lot of liberal news organizations, and I'm not reading it on any of those either. And I just find that somewhat interesting. And what makes it even more interesting is once they kicked the old white guy Biden out of being the candidate of the Democratic Party, now it's a woman. And I have heard that card played a little bit. That's be sexism, not racism. But you've got to support the first woman president. And if you don't, you're just sexist, right? This guilt that goes along with, like, it's identity politics. That you're not supposed to have identity politics, but by golly, if you don't vote for our person, well, you're engaged in identity politics. That is identity politics. You hear that a little bit from the supporters for Kamala, but strangely enough, I've heard very little, maybe a little bit, but very little reference to her ethnicity. And I think that's a good thing, actually. I'm very pleased that we're not having a lot of chatter about racism right now. I'm very pleased that there's not been any eruption of protests and fires and like some of the stuff that we've seen in the past, especially during political seasons. I remember when my kids were much younger and growing up, and like all of a sudden the topic of racism became very popular again. They couldn't understand it. Like them and their friends in school, they just didn't see life that way. And this is like them in middle school and stuff like that. But because over the last 10 plus years, it has been such a mainstay of conversation and of people on the left coming out and pushing, calling everything racism and white privilege, and it's all white people's fault. Like they've created racism in a whole new generation. I mean, I don't think you can do anything to now extinguish that from the children of this generation that are now growing into adulthood, because it was all just kind of thrown up in their faces. I mean, it was bad maybe in the 80s, but then, for a decade or two, it just wasn't a big deal, but we made it a big deal again. And so for at least this whole younger generation, it's going to be a big deal because people just won't let it die out. Now, why aren't we hearing it during this election cycle? I don't know. I can only speculate, but I think part of it is strangely enough, Trump, who people like to accuse of being a racist, he actually appeals to ethnic people. We like to say in the media, people of color, they like to say. He appeals to them at a much greater rate than what Republicans have in the past. Do you know, in terms of the Hispanic vote, Trump is up 11 points over Kamala amongst Hispanic voters. Traditionally, like Hispanics aren't like black voters in terms of just being like 90% Democrat. It's more evenly split, but it almost always has favored the Democrats. But interestingly enough, that trend has actually been changing over the last 15 or 20 years. And with Trump this year, he holds an 11-point advantage. And what's interesting is the Republicans are always claiming that the reason the Democrats want all these undocumented people in the country is because that's votes for them. But it seems to be that Hispanics in general are more conservative than the Democratic Party. And so if that ever was their motivation, that may be backfiring when your opponent has an 11-point advantage over you amongst the Hispanics. Trump is 55 points down when it comes to black voters. Now, what's interesting with that is in the last election in 2020, 92% of black people voted for Biden. But in this election, only 72% are going for the Democrats or Kamala, and Kamala's black. And so I was reading some articles that it's black men that aren't willing to vote for a black woman, and like coming up with all of these like excuses. But nonetheless, I wonder if the reason that we're not hearing so much about racism in this election cycle is because Trump does better with minorities, with ethnic voters. In 2020, 59% of Hispanics voted for Biden. And once again, in this election cycle, the majority by 11% are voting for Trump. And even though you have still 72% of black voters siding with the Democrats and Kamala, that's 20 percentage points less than what it was just 4 years ago. So I wonder if that has a part of why we're not hearing a lot of racism just a couple weeks before the election. Listen, I think it's a good thing. I really feel like the country had moved past it. But once again, because of the media, like you can always take any event and blow it up beyond what it actually is. We saw that with COVID. Will racist events happen? Absolutely, they will, and they do. And we can look at them, and and we can just like obsess and fixate on it. It's like when you fixate on anything, like you get a pain in your elbow, and all of a sudden, like that's all you think about is a pain in your elbow, and then like you think like it might be this or it might be that. You fixate on it, and it gets undue attention. And we can do that with race relations, and typically the media would pick up on when that's happened to, say, a black individual, but they ignore when the racism goes the other way. In fact, it's endorsed racism called like white privilege. In fact, there's a movie that had been made about it recently with, Matt Walsh, and it's Am I a Racist? And what's crazy is the amount of money that's made in keeping racism alive. And in there, he documents these people that give these talks and go into these corporations and teach people how to do away with their whiteness. And you got all these like guilty white people who are thinking like they're responsible for slavery, and when a rogue cop does this or that, or when some back Hills, Georgia person does this or that, right? Like it happens on both sides. But the amount of money that some of these experts in racism and white privilege are making, like they're making $25,000, $30,000, $50,000 for like 3-hour session to come into these, like they're getting rich off of racism. I always say you shouldn't get rich off the gospel. And listen, you shouldn't get rich off racism either. I mean, if it's real and you're appalled by it, how are you getting rich off of going and talking about it? So I'm here to tell you that there's a lot of reasons why racism is kept alive. And I don't know that that's ever going to stop, but it is definitely being blown out of proportion, way more than what it should. And I don't think it's going to stop as long as people think they can get votes off of it. And it's not going to stop as long as people think that they can make money off of it and get rich off of it. What does the Bible say about racism? Well, there shouldn't be any. And if you see people for their skin color, then like you need to stop. If you treat people differently because of their skin color or their gender, you need to stop. Plain and simple. Genesis 3:28 says there's neither Jew nor Greek. There's neither slave or free. There's neither male nor female. We're all one in Christ Jesus. That's just like, that's basic truth. And I think 80% of America, and that's where that movie, Am I a Racist? Like they would go and interview certain people, like Matt Walsh would go up to, black people in certain areas and say, what do you think of this? And what do you think of that? And they just laugh. They think it's all a joke. Like this is something that certainly was real at one point, but it's being kept alive for ulterior motives. So how do we prevent racism moving forward? Here's just a few different things to consider. One is like, we have to stop enabling people from playing the victim role. Regardless of skin color, when someone plays the victim, like as a pastor, I meet people from time to time, and they've got this mindset that they're always the victim. And you know what happens when someone has the mindset that they're always the victim and no one tells them anything any different? They convince themselves of it, that they're always the victim. It's always someone else's fault and they bear no responsibility. And like, I refuse to let people do that. If you're saying I don't have a job and I can't this, or I don't, so-and-so doesn't love me, like, and poor me, like nothing ever works out. Like, no, you're playing the victim and you're believing it yourself. And in the end, you're letting people treat you how you want to be treated or how you're willing to let people treat you. Well, the same is true in terms of race. When you let people play the victim role, oh, you're the victim, oh, poor you, oh, we should really give you reparations. Well, no, we should really, like, you should be allowed to come to the front of line because your ancestors from, 150 years ago were treated this way. And oh my goodness, I am so sorry for white people. Like, it convinces them that they're the victim. And when you're the victim, there's nothing you can do about it. So why even try? And it perpetuates a mindset. It perpetuates a standard of living. It perpetuates a culture that we ought not perpetuate. And so we don't help anyone out by encouraging them, oh, you're the victim. We need to stop doing identity politics. And I was reading an article that said the majority of white people have never voted for a person of color. I don't think that's true. I think I didn't research it, but Obama got, I think, the majority of the white vote, at least his first term. But I know this, under Biden got 92% of the black vote. And under Obama, it was like crazy, like 98 or 99%. That's identity politics. And that gets accused one way. That normally is being thrown on white people, and that's not accurate. You're going to see a much more even split between those that are voting for Obama or now Kamala amongst the white community than normally what you would see the other way. But we are actually seeing, and this is an encouraging sign, that 28% of black people are going to vote for Trump. That's good, and that's the way it should be. I get if the majority of people want to vote for someone of their ethnicity. I get a majority of people would want to vote for someone of their religion. If you have a Catholic running, well, of course the Catholics are going to vote for the Catholic. If you come from a German heritage, and not so much this way now, but maybe 50 years ago when this stuff mattered more, oh, this guy's a German, yeah, we're going to vote for him. Like that's some of that's just understandable, and there's nothing wrong with it. But you can't like lockstep anyone ethnicity vote for someone because of their ethnicity. Anyone gender vote for someone just because of their gender, and you can't make the other side feel bad because they don't. That is identity politics, and it's got to stop. We can't make everything about race. The media did that. The whole Jussie Smollett thing. He was attacked by these white people with MAGA hats, and he was just walking back from Subway, and it turned out it was all lies and made up, and people were like, they were freaking out about it. This just confirms how racist this country is, and it was all a lie. All a lie. Happens on the other side too, though. Just like 3 or 4 weeks ago, there was news that was circulating for about 12 hours that some church in, I think it was southwest Texas, a rural church, claimed that there were Middle Eastern people that had jumped out of a van and were trying to get into this church, and they had these guns, and people were, the security guards at the church were shooting at them to run them off. It turns out it was all made up. It was all a lie. So, like, it can't all be about race, and the media can't just jump on this stuff because they're looking to promote their view of America as just this incredibly racist country. We're not. Is there racism? Yes. But in general, are we? No. The average person doesn't think so. It's just being perpetuated because there's motivation, there's reason to perpetuate it. We need to stop reverse racism. You got to stop punishing people for being white. It's not evil or horrible because you're white. You don't have anything to apologize for because you're white. Worldwide, whites are minorities worldwide. I forget what the percentage is. I feel like just maybe 12% of the world's population is white. I mean, so worldwide, white's a minority, but like you don't have anything to apologize for being white. Yet mailers can be mailed out. If you're black, you can mail out specifically to black people. If you're Asian, you can mail out specifically to Asian people. But as a white, you're not. It is racist to mail out to just the white community. Frankly, I don't think anyone should be able to identify a certain race and only do a mailer to them. But like, it's got to be equal. It's got to be fair. Stop like punishing white people. Government awards contracts based upon people of color. Like so many contracts have to go to business owners that are people of color. It has nothing to do with who can do the job the best, do it the cheapest. It's about race. They do it with gender as well. I think they've started doing it with sexual orientation. Like, no, stop it. How about who's best? Everything else is just reverse racism. or racism by a different name. We have to stop focusing on the exceptions rather than the norm. And I touched on this briefly. Things are going to happen. It's a big country. We have 330 million. How many ever people we have? Like, there could be some mean things done. There's going to be animals tortured. There might even be a child sacrifice. And there's certainly going to be racist things that are done by each ethnicity towards others, because there is some element of racism out there, but you can't hyperfixate on them. And you can't make it bigger than what it is, because then you just convince everyone. It's kind of like that victim mentality. Tell us we're all racist enough, then okay, we're going to be racist. Keep making me feel bad for being white, and I'm going to start becoming salty about that, and you're going to make me a racist, right? Like, we can't hyperfixate on the exceptions and try to pretend that the norms, it will change the way that we see reality. And the NFL has become one of the worst for this, right? Like, for the last 3 or 4 years, every friggin' NFL game, if it's not painted on the out of bounds boundary in the end zone, or somehow on the field goal post, or on the back of people's helmets, it's just, stop the hatred, end racism. Like, you're going to convince us that we are. How often do you beat your kids? Stop beating your kids. We can't beat our kids. We can't punish our kids. Like, if you say that to a person enough, they're going to start thinking they beat their kids. We got to stop doing it. The good news is maybe sanity's returning a little bit. We've seen recently, and corporations have pushed back against DEI, which is diversity, equity, inclusion. Like, that determined how they hired. And it separates people into all kinds of groups. It causes us to assign value on people based upon their gender, their skin color, their sexual orientation. None of that should matter. And we're starting to see a pushback against that. And there's only 2 weeks left. And we're not hearing all this chatter about racism. Hopefully, could it possibly be that we're actually moving past this again, and we can start moving towards normalcy again in how we see this country and how we see one another? Time will only tell. Well, I appreciate you joining me for this episode of God Talk, and I look forward to talking to you next time. God bless.